When Dido established this city, the new city, a lot of people's eyes obviously opened wide and said, hey, a new city, a new start. And as these trading routes that Carthage pioneered expanded, it very rapidly became as international a city as anywhere then in the world.
Over the next 200 years, Carthage evolves into a major Mediterranean power, establishing colonies in Corsica, Ibiza, and North Africa.
By around 700, maybe 650 BC, Carthage is a force to be reckoned with. Everybody's heard of it. Nobody messes with it. It's a very important city.
Through expansive trade networks, by the 7th century BC, Carthage's new territories were generating a massive treasure chest, and its population reached 300,000, making it one of the biggest cities in the world. By the 6th century BC, Carthage was growing into a true city-state, brimming with magnificent temples, glittering palaces, and high-rise houses. But as Carthage's flame burned brighter, the flame of their Phoenician cousins was burning out. The great Phoenician city of Tyre fell to the Babylonians in 574 BC. Carthage was now on its own. Before long, the Carthaginians would sail beyond the dusty shores of North Africa, continuing to expand their empire by conquering the seas. 520 BC, 3,000 oars propel 60 ships through the Pillars of Hercules, known today as the Straits of Gibraltar. Hanno the Navigator, the great admiral of Carthage, is sailing to the edges of the known world. He is preparing to launch a power play that could lead to total domination of the Mediterranean.
So every great explorer, Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, who sailed off into the unknown, seems to me a very strong parallel for the original and best of them, Hanno the Navigator.
Hanno set sail to extend the boundaries of the Carthaginian network of colonies and exchange, not mere trading activities, but planting whole cities of new settlers to maintain control of land and access to its resources.
Carthage's technical prowess on the seas has brought it power and wealth. By the 6th century BC, the islands of Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands are now under its control. The hub of its power flows from a marvel of engineering, the harbor of Carthage.
Nobody has anything approaching this potency, this power, let alone this navigation and seafaring skill. So when the barriers are taken off the channel and shoof, within, they're scrambled, as they did in World War II with aeroplanes. These ships are coming out fast down this channel and out into the Mediterranean. People see them coming. Carthage is here.
For 2 centuries, Carthage dominated the Mediterranean. But a rival across the sea to the north was steadily evolving into a military machine of unparalleled potency. Rome. These two superpowers would soon find themselves in conflict over the jewel of the Mediterranean, Sicily.
Carthage was built to trade, and Sicily was critical to that trading. Why? Because it's right bang slap in the middle of the most important shipping lane in the world. Whoever controls Sicily controls these vital trade routes. The Romans saw the enormous riches that Carthage could command, and it started to just elbow into them. And the Carthaginians nudge back and say, hang on, we were there first. Please, as it were, get your tanks off my lawn.
Both Rome and Carthage now had settlements on Sicily. This tension would trigger a series of wars that would rock the ancient world. 264 BC, Rome and Carthage begin the First Punic War. 17 years later, the two sides are still deadlocked in a bloody slugfest. The stalemate appears to be broken only when a fierce and charismatic military commander named Hamilcar Barca takes control of the Carthaginian forces. March 10th, 241 BC, the fleets met at the Agates Islands off the western coast of Sicily for one of the greatest sea battles of all time.
In the hostilities of the First Punic War, the Battle of the Agates Islands, fought off the coast of Sicily, was a turning point.
In the battle between two brilliantly engineered fleets, Carthage had the advantage in numbers. But their sleek killing machines were bloated with grain and supplies for Hamilcar's army, camped out on nearby Sicily.
Many ships were sunk or lost or captured. People weren't expecting that.
Now the Carthaginians try to make a break for it, but they are unable to do so because of this extra weight. That gives the Romans the victory.
It was a strategic disaster. In the end, the Romans took nearly 30,000 Carthaginian prisoners. With no way of resupplying himself and his troops, Hamilcar was forced to surrender and retreat back to Carthage. It was clear the pendulum of power in the Mediterranean was now swinging ominously toward Rome. In victory, Rome gained not only Sicily, but also Carthage's holdings on Corsica, Sardinia, and the islands between Sicily and Africa. Hoping to cripple Carthage, Rome forced it to pay a large tribute. But Carthage was not ready to give up yet. It turned westward to Spain to generate new wealth.
And the Carthaginians send Hamilcar Barca to Spain, so his goal in 237 is to conquer as much of Spain as possible.
It took 9 hard-fought years for Hamilcar to conquer the native tribes there. When he finally did, all of the land south of the Ebro River becomes part of the Carthaginian Empire. But Hamilcar paid for that conquest with his life. In 228 BC, he was killed in battle with a rebelling native tribe. With an army poised to strike, is the man Romans fear and loathe above all, Hannibal, the great general of Carthage. Brilliant, brutal, sophisticated. He is Rome's worst nightmare.
There's no doubt in my mind that Hannibal wasn't one of the greatest generals in history. I think demonstrably he is the greatest general in history.
Hannibal's genius is born of a near religious zeal to destroy Rome, handed down to him by his father. In 221 BC, he was given the tools to do it. At the age of 26, he took command of the Carthaginian army. He would launch one of the most stunning campaigns of aggression the world had ever seen. Rome had gained control of the Mediterranean, meaning Hannibal could not reach his enemy by sea. Driven to fulfill the vow he had made to his father to destroy Rome, Hannibal set out to do the impossible. He'd march over land, across the Alps, to the heart of the Roman Empire.
Now Hannibal knows he's greatly outnumbered. He knows he has a relatively small army in comparison to the Romans, but he does come up with a strategy which he believes will bring him victory. And what he has to do is take his army to Italy itself and attack the Romans on their home field.
Hannibal set off in 218 BC with an army of 90,000 men, 12,000 horses, and 37 elephants acquired from African neighbors to the south.
Because the cavalry of the enemy could not withstand elephants, therefore Hannibal believes it's worth it to try to get these elephants to Italy.
By October, they'd traveled more than 600 miles and came face to face with their first major obstacle, the raging Rhone River in France.
Even at its narrowest, shallowest time of the year, the Rhone River is still going to be somewhere between 100 to 150 to 200 meters wide. It's going to be daunting to all of Hannibal's field engineers.
On the other side, a large number of Gauls were waiting to do battle. But the wall of water was a potentially deadly obstacle that had to be vanquished first. Hannibal's builders would have to conquer Mother Nature.
Not only are the engineering feats daunting, but you also have crowds of insubordinate and hostile tribes waiting on the other side of the river.
When all was ready, Hannibal gave the signal to release the barges. The Gauls, startled by his boldness, were mystified when they saw the Carthaginian general leading his troops, cavalry, and elephants en masse across the turbulent Rhone. When he arrived at the river's opposite bank, the Gauls broke in panic and fled without striking a blow. The entire operation took a little more than 9 days.
I think the crossing of the Rhone in such a short space of time using rudimentary equipment is one of the great achievements of military history. And people slightly forget the small engineering miracles that made all this possible.
Hannibal and his army continued on and made their way to the foot of the Alps. With winter looming, the troops were starving and exhausted. As they ascended, they confronted another seemingly impossible obstacle: giant boulders. Hannibal's engineers devise a plan that would allow the troops not just to go over, but through.
The stratagem of crossing the Alps certainly shocked the people of Italy. No one expected an army with elephants to make it across. And although the Alps may have seemed in places impassable, this idea of breaking up the mountains themselves to create a pathway to get your pachyderms across was a brilliant idea.
Now, how did Hannibal get his men, not to mention all those elephants, up, over, around, or through these giant boulders? Well, according to the Roman historian Livy, he came up with an ingenious plan along with his engineers that would literally move mountains. They cut big crevices through these boulders, and then they got wood from the surrounding forest. They'd wrap these boulders in the wood, and when the wind was right, they'd torch the wood. The rocks would heat up, and just when they were hot enough, they'd pour boiling vinegar into the crevices, which would shatter or melt the rocks such that his men could break them apart with iron implements. Now, what was Hannibal doing up in the Alps with all this vinegar? Well, if this is true, and we like to think it was, otherwise how did he get across the Alps? It speaks volumes to the genius of this brilliant general. I'll tell you one thing, after navigating the snow of the Alps, the sight of the plains of northern Italy must have been very, very welcome.
On August 2nd, 216 BC, near Cannae in southern Italy, Hannibal faced off against Roman forces under the command of Terentius Varro in a decisive conflict that would seal the fate of these two empires. As dawn breaks, Hannibal draws up a force of 50,000 men, newly strengthened with the help of hired mercenaries, against Varro's nearly 90,000 Romans. Varro decided to try and crush his opponent, sending a massive force to attack Hannibal's center. This would prove to be a fatal mistake. Anticipating Varro's strategy, Hannibal orders his cavalry to circumvent the Roman ranks from the rear.
Hannibal had certainly done his homework in studying the psychology of his opponents, and he was able to trick them into his center, and then his forces could engulf them.
Completely surrounded, the Romans were slaughtered where they stood. Only 3,500 Romans managed to escape. 10,000 were taken prisoner, and 70,000 were left dead on the battlefield.
At the Battle of Cannae, the single greatest defeat ever inflicted on a Roman army throughout its entire history. And of course, we have to go to World War I to find a scale of slaughter as big.
Cannae was a masterpiece of military strategy, but Hannibal was unable to capitalize on his string of victories. He fought on for another 13 years, mounting siege after siege on Rome and its surrounding cities. But ultimate victory remained elusive. He could defeat them in the field, but he lacked the proper weapons to take on the Roman capital. In 204 BC, Rome went on the offensive and launched an attack on Carthage. Hannibal finally returned home to muster its defense.
204 BC, Scipio Africanus, who had already beaten the Carthaginians in Spain, convinced Rome to let him go around Hannibal altogether and attack Carthage directly. Hannibal was recalled to his city to defend it. Now, these two heavyweights met and spoke. We have no idea what they said to one another. It's lost to history. In 202 BC, they met again at the Battle of Zama. And Hannibal was defeated, and he was forced to surrender to an enemy that he'd spent his entire life trying to destroy. He would not fulfill his father's wishes. He was exiled from Carthage, and years later, near present-day Turkey, he committed suicide.
Carthage's defeat at the end of the Second Punic War forces the empire to submit yet again to Roman terms.
They are forced to surrender in 202 BC. The Romans again impose very harsh peace terms on the Carthaginians, meaning, first of all, they must again pay an indemnity, a tax to the Romans. Also, the Carthaginians lose their overseas territories, meaning their territory is now confined to areas just around Carthage itself. One last very important part of this treaty was that Carthage could not fight a war, any war, even a defensive war, without Rome's okay.
The wall system surrounding Carthage made it the best fortified city in all of the Mediterranean, if not the world. And against the Romans, it would face its ultimate test, led by the fabled Carthaginian general, Hasdrubal.
The Carthaginian commander who would lead the Carthaginians during the Third Punic War was Hasdrubal. He is the one responsible for retaliating against the Numidians, and he is the guy who's going to be leading the main resistance.
As the Roman legions descended on the city, the Carthaginians hurriedly scrambled to build a new defensive force.
The women gave their hair up. They cut their hair so that they could make rope to fire the catapults. They emptied the prisons. The old men volunteered. People who hadn't been blacksmiths for 20 years said, "I'll try again," and they rearmed themselves in an explosion of intent and determination that we really have to go to the siege by the Germans of Stalingrad to see again.
In 2 months of frenzied work, they produced 6,000 shields, 18,000 swords, 30,000 spears, 120 ships, and 60,000 catapult missiles. Despite the arsenal Carthage had assembled, Rome had sent an overwhelming force. The city was alone, facing its own destruction.
There was no area left alone without Rome or Roman allies, with none of the colonies in a position to stand up to Rome. Carthage was left on her own.
The city hunkered down behind its immense fortifications, hoping against all odds that their walls would repel the impending Roman invasion.
Carthage held off the Roman attack for 3 years, and even in the last days after the Romans broke through the walls, it took 7 days before they could get to the top of the citadel, of moving through town like a juggernaut.
The Roman siege squeezed the life out of the city from the outside, and eventually, although the immense land wall was never breached, the Romans managed to scale those at sea. Inside the city, the fighting continued street by street. Few Carthaginian snipers were left, but they were so fierce that the Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus ordered the city to be set on fire and leveled. Thousands of Carthaginians were burned alive in the blaze.
It was a firestorm. It must have been hellish for the residents, people fleeing.
During its siege and capture, Carthage had been decimated. The city's population fell from 500,000 to 50,000. The survivors were sold as slaves, never to return home.